Before we get super far into the course, I think it's important that you have a little bit better understanding of exactly what GitHub is, not just an understanding of how we're using it. So we're using it to build websites, or a very simplified website, using their Markdown code. But that's not what GitHub was made for. If we go to their main page, it says here that it's built for developers. It is a development platform inspired by the way you work, from open source to business, blah, blah, blah. You can host and review code, manage projects, build software alongside 30 million developers. Creating a little GitHub page is not the same thing as hosting and reviewing code. It's not what they, well, technically maybe it is, but that's not what they mean by it. It's not managing projects, well, sort of, but not exactly the way they mean it. And it's definitely not building software. We're just building a little simple page using Markdown. Now, what is Markdown? Because we've talked about Markdown a little bit, right, here and there, or at least we've mentioned Markdown. So, Markdown, from Wikipedia, and here's the little icon for it. It's a lightweight markup language with plain text format syntax. Converted to HTML and many other formats, blah, blah, da, 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 da. And there's stuff about it, but that's not really important. Now, we aren't using regular Markdown. We are using GitHub's version of Markdown, which is very close to the same thing. There just might be a few little changes here and there. That's not very important. Now, the reason that I'm saying some of this and going over some of this is when we create our own accounts and we have our own pages, so this is once you've logged in, you can see activity here, you can see different people who have forked the code. Your login might be on here. When you went to one of my pages, and like my readme.md, and you clicked the little pencil to edit, that created your own version of my code. That created a fork of it. So on here you can see 61 forks, and we can see all the different people who have done that at some point. Here we go. There they are. Now, what I was just talking about Markdown, let's go back onto that before we talk about some of the other stuff. Going into here and going to my settings to view the page, if we look at that versus the README file, here's the README file. This is the Markdown, right? Whether we're using pound signs or asterisks or square brackets and parentheses to create links, or squiggles to cross things out, that's Markdown, which is a markup language, right? A very simple markup language. Now, when we make a change here, like let's say that I delete that and make it a little bit closer to my username, when I delete that and I go down here and I hit commit changes, notice the terminology commit. I'm sure you've already noticed it before. I also have the option here to do create a new branch for this commit. So some of this terminology is based on what GitHub is actually designed to do, as opposed to the way that we're using it. But we'll go into some of that stuff later on. So when I hit commit changes, and it says it's done, right? We see it here, but when we go here, it's not immediate, right? So what Git is doing is it is going to have to convert that Markdown into HTML, and then it changes the address. See, like this versus that, like the addresses are a little different. So it takes a few minutes for it to go through and everything, and depending on how impatient you're feeling, sometimes that might seem unreasonable, but that's just the way it is. Part of that too, though, is like they're not really worried about it being instantaneous, because that's not the point of GitHub. GitHub is about hosting or storing code that different developers use around the world. We're just using it as sort of a website to show work. And if you decide to go into any serious technology fields, you should be familiar with GitHub, and you should probably be using it anyway. Or if you decide not to use it, you should at least know why you don't like it and why you're deciding not to use it. Now, let's talk a little bit more about some of that terminology, right? If we're looking here, we can see how many lines it says this is. So that is this here, 29 lines, even if some are blank. The 25 there, that is from, so we have 29, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 of them are blank. So 25 of them have content on it, so that's what that 25 is. So there's 29 lines, 25 of them actually have content on them. One contributor, That's me. The size. Got a couple things over here. I don't want to really worry about them too much. I do want to talk about history. So history shows all of the changes over time. And that's what the committing is. And that's kind of the idea of the GitHub in general. GitHub is about a version control system called Git that tracks changes over time. And what that can do is when you go into like the file and you edit something, it does not like me going back to this again and again. Let's refresh. When you edit something, you're making changes, right? And you sort of assume that if you mess something up, you have lost the previous, right? Like the previous is gone. Whatever I have now is what I have, so I hope I didn't screw it up too badly. That is not true with Git or with GitHub or with version control systems like this that are designed well. This history, you can go back to previous versions. This is basically access to the previous versions. And this number here is sort of like an ID number related to like that change, like the file at that point in time. This is sort of like a way to ID it to make sure that like you're getting what you think you're getting. Because if you have a whole bunch, like some of these where I was first setting up the document, like maybe here, like, oh, which one is it? Is it the second one on the 21st, or is it the third one? Or, and that's not even very many. What if there were like 100 or something on there? This can allow you to be very specific to make sure that you're getting the right one. So if we click on one of these IDs, like I can click on this one here, this shows the changes. I added this, I lost that. That was the line that was changed. This was the old line 2, this was the new line 2. So this is sort of a simplified version of the changes, but I can also click this to see more specifically, like the way that is actually shown in the Markdown. Go back. I've got this option as well, so if I don't like seeing it sort of all overlapping, I can see the two side by side like this. In addition to just that specific file, I can also go back and view the whole repository. So if I modified a bunch of things and I think I screwed up a whole bunch, I can go back to a previous point in time and have like that version of everything that was in the folder at that point in time. So there's some pretty cool stuff you can do with that. When I had you guys like add in the syllabus or in the course description, I told you to like go into the file and click the little pencil, and that made a fork for you, but you don't have to do it that way. You could do it a different way. I just thought that would probably be the easiest at this point in time. If you had another browser, if I open another browser to one where if I open another browser where I'm not logged in, here you can see more or less what you would have seen. I can go to like the syllabus here, and I can't click the pencil right now because I haven't signed in, but instead I could go back here and I could actually like download this repository with everything in it. And that's one of the cool things about GitHub, is that it lets you like see other people's work. So if you find some really cool people on GitHub that are doing some cool stuff, you can see what they're doing and see how the code works or whatnot. So that's pretty cool. So here's these files, right? Here are the Markdown files, which are displaying as executable files, which is a little weird, but whatever. And there's other stuff in here and whatnot. So that's kind of cool. Now, the other thing, though, too, is you might be thinking, like, well, what if I don't want my work public? What if I don't want everyone to be able to see it? So that's where, when you're signing up, you get into choosing your plan. That's these Git private repositories. That's where you have to, like, pay. That's the only way for them to be private. Now, that being said, you don't have to use GitHub if you want to be a big programmer. There are other services that maybe have different prices. You can also use Git on your desktop. The nice thing about GitHub is if you're on any computer and you're using GitHub, you have access to your stuff without having to pay money. As far as like a class goes, that's really convenient too, because then you can upload your work there and I can see your work and etc. We don't have to worry about it being like the wrong version or whatever if you're constantly updating it. And we'll talk about some more of that stuff later. So if you really want to become like a professional programmer or something, or you've got some projects that you're working on for clients or something, then you might need to do one of those paid plans if you're wanting to store stuff on GitHub. But there are other options too where you don't necessarily have to store stuff online on GitHub on this service. There are other options, but that's really outside of the scope of this class. So that's what I wanted to go over about GitHub today for right now. There's a lot more to GitHub, and we'll talk more about it as we continue throughout the class.